Hey guys, it's Jade. I slept for like 3 hours last night because the last chapter of Word came out and I stayed up for that. Um, so I'm just gonna read this right here. Um, I'm still in my pajamas. I haven't made up my bed or anything. I'm just gonna start reading Signature and just kind of voice my opinion. I'm really excited to find out who the new protagonist is. Blake was a really cool dude, and I really felt for him, and I rooted for him and Rose to get along, and I cried when he found his little familiar. And now that I know that we've been building up the last 7 arcs to prepare for this new protagonist, I'm sure that he's kinder and more compassionate and even more heroic than Blake was. If Blake had to die to bring us Buttsack. So we were getting a physical description of Buttsack. It says his loose skin maintained an appearance and smell like the body parts that were his namesake, and he was grotesquely fat for his 3-foot frame, giving him an uneven, ungainly appearance. His legs were like overstuffed sausages sticking out from the stolen, piss-stained pair of shorts he wore. You can tell we're in it for the long haul with Buttsack here because we never got this level of detailed description about Blake. We just knew he was blonde. But I'm glad with Buttsack we actually know what he looks like. At one point, Buttsack says, or the narration by Buttsack says, the dumpy-looking fuck shut one of the metal cabinets, then hooked a lock onto it. See, Blake only observed and commented on people if that person was Alexis. Thank God Buttsack actually gives his opinion on people right off the bat, so we don't have to do as much thinking and stuff. What a huge step up. Buttsack is just cutting right to the chase and telling us exactly what he thinks. I'm really loving this narration. Oh man, I knew that our new protagonist would have to have a tragic backstory, and it seems like Buttsack has the most tragic of all. He's in a high school. Fortunately, Blake was able to escape high school, and I really hope for Buttsack's sake that he's so lucky. Okay, so Buttsack walks into a bathroom, and it says, some bitch sat on the windowsill while her kinkled friend smeared powder all over her face. I stopped reading at this point and just laughed for 5 minutes. I could not calm down. I was just giggling. I'm really interested to see what goblins, and Buttsack in particular, feel about physical appearance. Buttsack describes himself as being very ugly, but he doesn't seem to dislike that about himself. However, all of his narration is about pointing out other people's flaws. I want to know what goblins think of themselves, and do they think that their appearance is a detriment? Do they resent it? Do they resent that other people don't like the way they look or smell? Interesting. So then our hero poisons a girl's insulin. What are you doing, Buttsack? Buttsack, what the fuck? Alright guys, let's talk about Maggie. Thank God. Oh, I wonder if any part of Wildbow's decision making there was playing a prank on the readers, just since everybody was waiting to see who the new protagonist would be. I wonder if he put Buttsack there right at the beginning in any part to try to make people believe for a few paragraphs that Buttsack would be the protagonist of Pact from now on. It was fun. So I want to talk about Maggie and Lola. So Lola Duchamp is this other girl who goes to school with Maggie, who is a practitioner, and she sort of serves as almost like a generic Jacob's Bell practitioner kid. All of them have some kind of expectation based on their family role. All of them were raised in magic and have these sort of expectations for how things are. And yeah, Lola has her own personality. I'm not going to say that, but we see Lola first, not to introduce Lola as a character, particularly, but to introduce how the next generation of Jacob's Bell practitioners is going to behave. So when we switch to Maggie's perspective, she's in the bathroom with Lola, and immediately she comes across as lonely. Not consciously, achingly lonely, but just lonely enough that it's affecting her decisions and she hasn't quite figured that out yet. She tells Lola that she doesn't really expect for them to be friends, and then only a few paragraphs later asks if they are. She spends a lot of time talking to the other practitioners, even though she knows that they have no interest in being her friend. More on that later. This may surprise you, because I've spent a lot of time in this video series complaining about people in Pact. But I don't like Lola. And I dislike Lola more than I dislike Paige. But I'm not going to go on a long rant about how much I dislike Lola. I'm just going to go on a regular-sized one. Lola has drank the Kool-Aid. And again, Lola is our default Jacob's Bell teenage practitioner. She, for one, has no interest in ever giving Maggie a chance at friendship. She's already been convinced that dealing with demons or diabolists or goblins or goblin queens is despicable, but killing them or otherwise being mean to them is also despicable. She doesn't appear to have really thought through any of these philosophical questions. She just drank the Kool-Aid. Lola taunts Maggie for having killed Molly. And so Maggie says at one point, Lola kept bringing that up. Lola had to know the effects the words had, and it rankled. She had no idea what was involved, the sleepless nights, the shame, and yet she threw it out there. Okay, counterpoint. Does Lola know the effects that her words have? I don't think the Duchamp children are necessarily raised to be the most morally upright and humble kids in town. She's been raised in magic, and she just watched a girl's insulin get contaminated with cocaine, and she doesn't appear to give a flying shit. I don't think that Lola sees taunting Maggie about killing Molly as being such a big deal as it is to Maggie, because I don't think Lola has the capacity for empathy that Maggie does. Okay, maybe the capacity, but she's not using it. She's not in the habit of using it. And then the part that really ticked me off is that so the Duchamps and the Behaims are not allowed to mess with the goblins, but they're still clearly a scourge on society. And Lola gives Maggie serious shit for dealing with the goblins, you know, making the school and Jacob's Bell a better place, just because goblins are disgusting. And it really comes off as privileged and awful. It's like the person that doesn't want to interact with trash collectors because they think that trash collectors are lower than them or whatever. It makes Lola look weak and unable to deal with the fact that some people are going to be dealing with ugly things. Just because you don't like bugs doesn't mean exterminators shouldn't exist, Lola. It comes across just horribly. But I can take this a little bit further. So, Lola considers Maggie's form of magic to be very low and dirty. But what Maggie is doing is effectively protecting the members of her high school from pests that can kill them. She's doing some of the most morally upright magic we've seen in the story. Now let's compare that to Lola. Lola's a Duchamp. They mess with people's emotions and connections. Later on in this chapter, we're going to see, or later on in this arc, we're going to see that one of the Behane boys fucks with the connection that he has with a girl in their class to try to get her to go out with him. It's effectively a love potion, which is the magical term for date rape drug. That's the kind of things that the Duchamps specialize in. And yeah, they have plenty of morally upright uses for their power, such as making other people more powerful. But they've never expressed any kind of desire to use their power in a morally upright way. And I don't get the sense that Lola Duchamp here is going to change that. Lola's magic is more morally reprehensible than Maggie's. She just isn't interested in examining these questions. She'd just rather feel like she's better than everyone else. We get an awful lot of, kind of table setting for how Maggie is doing emotionally. She's, at this point, borderline depressed. She's desperate for friendship. She's desperate for any kind of conversation, even with people who hate her. Later on, she drags on this conversation with Elspeth for just a little bit longer than necessary so that she can talk to somebody, even though she knows Elspeth just wants to leave. She can't really talk to her dads. We see later that they have basically ostriched themselves to the full reality of what's going on. So she keeps holding on to this hope that everything will be nebulously better when Blake gets back. And it will be better for her when Blake gets back. She's not wrong. She doesn't have access to the books, which is the thing that will make her more powerful. But anyone who's been around this book, Maggie included, should know that Blake's presence doesn't make stuff calm or better. Okay, better sometimes, but not... Blake isn't a solution you can really rely on, as much as I really like Blake. It just shows how desperate she is when Blake, of all people, is the person she's holding out her hope for. I adore Maggie. By the end of this chapter, I am as invested in Maggie as I ever was in Blake. But unfortunately, a lot of my investment in her character comes from the fact that everybody else treats her like shit. And fortunately or not, that leaves me in the position of bitching about every other character that's in this. Not all of them, but most of them. So on that note, the next person in line for a tongue lashing is Gavin Behane. So when the Duham kids pull Maggie outside and ask her to, and talk to her about maybe making a contract that would forbid her from working with the Thorburns, she points out that Gavin attacked her shortly after she arrived in town. And he says, "I was asked to test your measure, see how you operated, what kind of practitioner you were. I did as I was asked. Whatever your excuse, you came after me with excess force, and you needed to know that when you make enemies here, on top of crossing lines and drawing interest from non-practitioners, you put yourself in a dangerous position. So I voted. Others will do the same until you clue in." Okay, so I have this fancy bullshit translator machine, and I fed Gavin's bullshit speech through it, and here's what came out. "I was just following orders, so what I did was not my responsibility, but what I was doing was explicitly for the purpose of causing you to display force, and I refuse to take responsibility for the fact that you reacted to a thing I did. So die, bitch, but only symbolically." Yeah. The rest of the Duham children are similarly displeasing. I don't like them. They're a bunch of entitled little shits. They're everything that I complained about before we got Black Lamb's Blood. That no one who's already embedded in the practitioner world is interested in trying to do the right thing. You get people like Maggie and Blake who are coming in from the outside, and hopefully people like Alexis and Ty and Tiff, who have a perspective that is developed towards doing something other than what the Duchamps and the Behames are doing. But for all of the kids we see here, they have no reason to try to be anything else. And I really hope they snap out of it or wake up or come to their senses or whatever, start to question. But at this point, they suck. But at this point, they're just horrible. So the interesting thing about this whole setup and what we know up to this point is that we still believe Maggie is going to turn these people down and go to Blake. So we are, as the audience, picking out the things that indicate that she is going to choose not to sign the contract. We're picking out the parts, and by we I mean me, but I'm pretty sure that I had the typical experience of reading this. We're picking out the parts where she says that she misses Blake and that she can't wait for him to come back, and the hypocrisy in her statements about not wanting friends but acting like she wants them. We're waiting to see what changes Maggie's mind. And it's a knife point balancing act that Wildbow has pulled off here, making it so that we believe that what is being built up is going towards something entirely different. It seems like one or two little pushes is all Maggie really needs. So when she considers the difference between the Thorburns and the Duhaimes offers to be the Thorburns offering 1 part friendship and 1 part power, and the Duhaimes offering 0 parts friendship and 2 part power, everything Maggie has set up to this point indicates that she would take the 2 parts power. But we are looking at the evidence that she's going to take the 1 part friendship, 1 part power. It's fascinating. Through this whole thing, we're already rationalizing, why will she take the Thorburn deal? Even though she never actually does. Excellent. The moment where Maggie goes to talk to Molly cemented this as my favorite chapter so far. It's so sad, and Molly's soul doesn't even appear to be there. Molly is less of a person left than June was, even. She has no words, she can't go forward and back in time. She's just a fraction of the Echo that we've seen in some of the other ghosts. Maggie is talking to and trying to reassure this ghost, which is nice and kind, but it's clear that she's doing this almost entirely for herself. Still, letting off steam by being kind to others immediately endeared me to Maggie. This is the point when I decided that I liked her as much as I liked Blake. In one chapter of narration. And yeah, she had 2.y, but that was a while ago. So I want to talk about the idea of Padraic being bored and trying to keep from losing his mind. And I know there's funky pronunciation crap. I'm going to call him Padraic. Sorry. I've always been uncomfortable with the idea in fiction that if you just keep on living, you're eventually going to decide you don't want to anymore. It's not something that I've ever actually bought. I mean, it's possible, but I can't. It's not something that I can really empathize with, and it's not something that I've really met anyone human who has felt. There are people who decide that they no longer want to live in this world, but it's usually not because they are bored. And I think that for a longer lived race, it should be entirely possible to maintain your sanity and vigor. But I'm a bit of a transhumanist. I believe that we should be trying to extend the lives of humans and, go to space and become the best we can be. So this isn't really a concept that appeals to me. The idea that if you just live so long, you're gonna not like it anymore. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So if you think about the generic fantasy depictions of elves, right? And I'm gonna and just go ahead and shove Vulcans in there too. They don't normally have this issue. They don't lose it. They don't decide that they've lived too long, even though they're usually living on the order of 800 years or 250 if you're a Vulcan. But the thing about that is that they are living in a society full of other people who live as long as they do. Their whole society can be progressed. together. Now, I don't want to say that the key to these longer-lived societies' happiness is segregation, because that's stupid. But I want to talk about this from the perspective of a race like Padraics, like the fairies. So I used to own goldfish. I owned 2 goldfish when I was in 4th grade. One lived for 4 months and the other lived for 1 month. And then I owned a betta fish in college and it lived for 1 month after I bought it. And I bought these things not so that I could have like a colony or a sustaining aquarium. I bought them so that I could care about the individual fish. I wanted a pet. When they died almost immediately, I was crushed. And after the 3rd fish, I went, you know what? This sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. So now I have a cat, and I've had a cat for the last 9 years, and so she's 10 now. So she's getting pretty old. And when she dies, I will be devastated. But she's been a part of my life for a significant portion of it. She has grown up with me. I have gotten more comfort out of her presence than the goldfish that lived for 1 month, which brought me joy while I had it and then just brought me disappointment, guilt, and pain. Padraic lives an incredibly long time, and we are the goldfish in this situation. And instead of deciding, you know what, I don't want to deal with these humans anymore, he became all right with the humans dying, with the humans being less than sentient, with the humans being objects. And it is monstrous. The things that he's doing to people, ruining their lives because he considers them to be toys, it's awful. But it makes sense if you think of it in the context of the inequality between the species. Padraic needs, in an idealist story, Padraic would realize that he's being a dick and find a way to entertain himself a different way. We don't consider, say, rats to be an important part of our society, but it's also a crime to torture animals even if they're pests. That being said, I don't like Padraic. He's incredibly manipulative, so I'm kind of skipping ahead to the scene in the potato bar, which, oh my god, I want to have a potato bar here. We don't have them. He uses glamour and regular ass manipulation tactics so that when Maggie is able to brush off the glamour, she thinks that she's in control. For example, he pretends that he's interested in being her familiar, and he isn't, but it puts Maggie in the mindset of thinking about all the reasons why she doesn't want Padraic to be her familiar. So she's distracted, and she doesn't realize that he's trying to do something completely different, and that he lied. Okay, he didn't lie, but he's not being honest. Speaking of which, I really appreciate the fact that Maggie is the best representation of what most of us would be like in this story. I am not good at picking out, what's the loophole in whatever this person said. And while I was able to pick out that he was lying about being interested in being her familiar, that's because I was reading this really, really slowly and trying to figure out what was about to happen. Maggie's inability to read Padraic's intentions in a regularly paced conversation is exactly how most of us would get, our names taken away or whatever. They say that the only others left are the ones who haven't been killed by humans. The same is probably true for practitioners. Maggie thinks that she's pretty cautious, but she's not as cautious as she needs to be. And it makes her feel very relatable because she makes all the mistakes that I feel like I would make. Also, on the point of Padraic being really annoying, the glamorizing your emotions thing would be annoying as hell. If Padraic were the optimal familiar for a hypothetical practitioner me, and even if I knew that he wasn't about to screw me over, just the whole I'm gonna screw with your emotions just because we're having a conversation thing would make me just fucking lose it. Like, that's That is annoying as shit. I could not deal with that. I'm shocked that Maggie was able to handle being around this person for any length of time, and it only really worked because she didn't have anybody else. Ugh. The moment that Padraic took her name was incredible. And I'm sure this has been said to death, but I wanted to talk about why I think this was so cool. I've always heard that fairies in fairy tales are evil because they make horrible deals and take things from you. And I've never really read a fairy tale that happened to have fairies in it. You know, my only exposure to fairies is like Tinkerbell and, you know, other examples that are completely unrelated to this concept. But the example that always comes up is, the example that I've heard the most is a fairy taking your name. And I did not get it before this. So seeing it here was, I mean, it sucked. It was horrible, but it was really cool. It's just like in the first episode of this, I said that I love the concept of your reflection being another person, because it seems like the kind of move that an old school fairy tale would make, but that a newer fairy tale would be too afraid or too embarrassed to include. This whole taking your name away thing feels like a centuries old concept that we haven't seen anywhere recently. So now I understand what fairy taking your name away means, but B, it's just so almost alien as a concept, and I still got it. So I want to talk about how I think the connections work now. So my apologies, I realized only after I made this that the colors are not consistent at all. But, alright, so blue dot is Maggie, and red dot is all the people she knows. And the connections have to go two ways, right? And I feel like this is my understanding of how connections work in this world overall. So there's a connection going from Maggie to, say, her dad. I just gave you all the finger foods. There's a connection going from Maggie to her dad, and from Maggie to Molly, and from Maggie to her mom. And all of those people have connections that go back. And this black circle over here is Padraic. So when Padraic takes her name, all of the connections that went from someone else to Maggie instead go to Padraic, because they're addressed to Maggie Holt, and Maggie Holt is over here now. But the girl in the checkered scarf still has all these connections going outwards. So she still remembers all these people, just nothing is coming back. So how does this fit in with our abstract demon and Blake? So it seems to me, and this is just my guess, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, that the abstract demon comes up to poor Blake here, does something to his connections, so, you know, it goes out from here, goes to, say, Alexis, and cuts off this connection, and cuts off this connection, cuts off this connection, right? So what everybody else ends up with is no connection that goes back to Blake. However, there's no longer an arrow pointing directly to the girl with the checkered scarf. Padraic may not remember Blake anymore, but the girl in the checkered scarf does. So yeah, that's how I think that works. So hopefully this means that Blake retains at least some of his memories of what everybody else is like, even if they don't remember him. Because if he doesn't remember anybody, he's just going to be a nonverbal potato with no agency. So after this, the girl in the checkered scarf chases after Padraic. And as I was reading this, it felt so hopeless, right? Because Padraic is so much more powerful than she is. And having the name Maggie Holt means everything to him, because it means that he can travel. It means that he can solve his one problem, which is being bored out of his mind, screwing high schoolers in Jacob's Bell. Sandra later says that maybe she should wait for Padraic to get bored, but I don't think Padraic is in a position to just get bored and give the name back. He had a problem, and Maggie's name solved it. It's not like he was just fucking with her for fun. So I want to talk about the nature of long serials like this. This book is what? The length of the entire Harry Potter saga? -1? I don't know. I should have looked that up. But it's long. There's this idea in film criticism that everything has to be like sleek and efficient storytelling is held up as, it's a compliment. You have to tell the shortest possible story or you are wasting everybody's time. And I disagree. The shortest possible story is not watching the movie. It is going back to your house's office and doing your taxes, because that's a more productive thing to be doing. Stories are not necessary. They do have a place in society, don't get me wrong, but if you feel like too much story is a waste of time, why are you watching it? We aren't watching movies or reading books usually for the utility of enriching our brains, of beaming things into our eyes that will make us think slightly differently. We watch them for entertainment. And I realized this when I watched the 1954 film Seven Samurai. Seven Samurai has been remade a bunch of times as The Magnificent Seven and two movies called The Magnificent Seven that I actually saw. And both of those were good, but when I saw the 1954 version, which is 4 hours long, I loved it so much more because I cared about all the characters and the villagers and stuff. I think it had something to do with the fact that I had so much time to dwell on the emotions that I felt. The movie had room to breathe. So obviously this applies to Wildbow's works. They're long for sure, but they're not efficient either. The stories are complex, and if you just take chunks out of it at random, it's not going to make sense. But there are entire characters in both of Wildbow's works that I've read so far. I can't come down on anyone in particular in Pact, but in both Worm and Ward, there were characters that if you took them out of the story, nothing would change. I mean, people's character arcs might change slightly because somebody wasn't around, but you could take certain characters out of Worm, and the end result would be identical. So why did Wildbow put them in? Because reading is fun. Each individual chapter of each story has to be enjoyable to read. The characters progress slowly like people. If Wildbow wanted to tell an efficient story, it would be Blake had a hard time being accepted on the council in Jacob's Bell. So he went, promised the Jacob's Bell Council that he was going to be a great guy. They accepted him, and then they had a big dance party. That was boring as shit. But by making things happen over time, at the end everything feels earned. But that concept of adding more length to things doesn't apply to everything. Padraic's letter is what I'm talking about. It has so many paragraphs of just gleeful gloating. There are several paragraphs where he's just like, I could say this, and I'm going to elaborate on this thing that I could say. Oh, but I'm not going to say that. Okay, and then here's a new thing that I could have done, and here's why I could have done it, but I didn't do it. I'm just talking because I like to talk, and I have a captive audience. He's such a stereotypical fairy, right? He wants attention, and he realizes that Maggie is in such a desperate situation that she will read any words that he writes carefully, and so he takes the opportunity to just write as much as he possibly can. He just wants Maggie to be looking at the words he wrote for the longest possible period of time. I hate him so much. So, while I was reading the letter, I was really frustrated with Padraic, and I was like, I want to strangle this guy, but in a fun way, right? And then we get to the end of the letter, and he signed the name Maggie Holt with a heart over the I, and the girl formerly known as Maggie says, I don't sign my name with a heart over the I. And one of the goblins goes, it doesn't matter. And she goes, yeah, it does. And it just kind of brought the mood back down to somber for me. it was kind of fun there for a minute, and then it wasn't. This is still a horrible thing that happened to Maggie. So there's a very exciting chase scene where Maggie tries to get away from the goblins. I came up with a bunch of theories on how she could do so, like locking herself in a locker, or and this is how I would do it, but it would be like definitely a thing that would get me killed in this situation. It would just be the first thing that came to mind, and then it would be like a really dumb idea, and I would die. Is to try to lure them into the time slowing circle. Yeah, don't do that. So the girl in the checkered scarf is chased around by a bunch of goblins, and eventually she is able to get sanctuary from Sandra Duchamp. And it feels so nice. Like at first you're like, really? Sandra Duchamp? Like, Sandra Duchamp? But she doesn't come across as being manipulative here. She seems like she's just embarrassed to admit that she wants to be helpful. And other than that, she's not doing anything dishonest. And this is communicated by, throughout the whole state that the girl has with Sandra, she keeps messing up in little ways. She interrupts Sandra when she's talking, she coughs up the cranberry juice, she gets in the way of Sandra's solitary life. And every time she does it, you just kind of tense up, because is this the moment that Sandra is going to go, you know what? I tried to help you and you spit out my cranberry juice. Get out. And she doesn't. She genuinely wants to help the girl in the checkered scarf. And so this brings me to the discussion of, should Sandra be the Lord of Jacob's Bell? So Sandra talks about how she would like to be Lord of Jacob's Bell, and I think it's a good idea based on what we've seen here. She's not perfect, but you know, practitioners certainly aren't. Other than the fact that she's sick to Jeremy on Blake, I think she's a great option. And here's why. I made a little list. So she has effectively been groomed for this. As a Duchamp, she is highly educated. She studied philosophy and English. She is a very skilled practitioner who knows everything about practicing. She's able to help Maggie, who we see later is actually quite skilled at certain types of magic. So she knows generally what everyone is capable of and what kind of magic exists. She knows the insides and outs of Jacob's Bell. It's not like Laird trying to become Lord of Toronto. Not that he was really trying to do that. She has always lived here. However, she has observed Conquest lordship over Toronto for the last 30 plus years. So she has been effectively studying what a lordship is and entails. And she doesn't seem to be power hungry. She's not obsessed with becoming lord. She just knows what that means. And she knows it better than probably anyone else in Jacob's Bell. She alludes to having extra emotional energy to devote to something. And we do want a leader who cares. The secret emotion that she has is generosity. She hides the fact that she actually wants to be helpful behind, I'm just consider it wasted maternal instinct or whatever. And lastly, she wants to be Lord of Jacob's Bell. There's this common adage that people who are leaders should not want to be the leader. And maybe I'm wrong, but I think that's bullshit. Okay, for one, think about any other job. If you give somebody a job that they hate, they're going to do a bad job. The adage that somebody should not want to be leader just refers to the fact that somebody should not be power hungry. Not that they should be the town shut-in who enjoys watching TV all day and doesn't have any particular ambition. A person who actively wants to be a leader, who wants to make the town better, who wants to look out for others, is the right choice, is the person who is going to put effort into being a good leader, who is going to put effort into making Jacob's Bell what the people want. Yeah, you don't want an asshole. but that doesn't mean you shouldn't want somebody who is ready emotionally to take the job. Anyway, I hope she isn't evil. Sandra makes this speech about Laird being bound to this life, and yeah, it's painfully reminiscent of the plan that Rose and Eamon were talking about trying to get out of, but I don't know enough about this to come down on it yet. I was going to say that at least it's only Laird who has this burden, but all of the young Duhame kids are acting like pawns, like cookie cutter members of their family, which I think is exactly what Rose Sr. was trying to stop. We will get back to this at a later time. Just a cute detail. The girl in the checkered scarf mentions that both of the boys she ever actually liked turned out to be gay. There's a cute joke in there somewhere about girls liking boys that remind them of their dad. I understand how that can be annoying for poor little Maggie, but I just found it charming. So the girl goes to meet with Mara and stuff happens, and then she goes to meet with the twins and stuff happens. And I just want to take this opportunity to point out something that I don't really have a better place to put it. Official prediction. I don't have too much going on here, but I'm just going to mention it. Rose is the real Thorburn heir now. She is the lady who the letter is addressed to. She's supposed to marry somebody who's kind of a bastard. I think it's going to be Andy. Or at least Andy's going to be in the running. It looked like a red herring for a little while. But I'm Andy. I think that's been foreshadowed. So I want to talk about Johannes. Yikes. So I want to give some background information about myself. So the thing that I have always cared about most is robots. From the age of being a toddler, always found, R2-D2 and that kind of character to be fascinating. I spent the entirety of kindergarten obsessed with Spot from Math Blasters. I find cute, non-verbal robots to be just endearing and fascinating. I studied robotics in college. I don't currently have a job working with robots, but my goal is to get into one. I stopped counting after the 17th time I watched the movie WALL-E. So that's the kind of thing that I empathize with. And I also really like robots that do talk. Data is my favorite Star Trek character. I like robots, okay? So when you try to argue to me that something is not, that thing's not a real human, or that thing's not really sentient, so we don't value that thing's life, I don't buy it. The same thing that makes me care about the same thing that makes me empathize with R2-D2 is the thing that made me go, June is a person and we need to treat her fairly. It legitimately did not occur to me that what Johannes is doing with having vestiges be hunted isn't monstrous. When we found these 4 middle school aged vestiges that just exist to be prey, I was horrified. Johannes became irredeemable in my eyes. There is not a single thought process I've ever had in my life that indicates to me that this is something that isn't abhorrent. There's this episode in Star Trek: The Next Generation where Data is basically put on trial for whether he should be considered sentient. It's called The Measure of a Man, and the final conceit of that episode, spoilers I guess, but it came out in the 80s, get with the program, is that we cannot truly know if something is sentient. But if something acts like it's sentient and insists that it is, we have to give it the benefit of the doubt and behave as if it is sentient. If we care about Molly's non-verbal, non-reactive ghost, we have to care about these kids who are full of mice and afraid and want to go home. Johannes says that at least part of what he's doing is to protect the city by providing harmful others something to hunt. I'm willing to concede that I have a potentially unpopular opinion here. But this is not really something I foresee myself ever being truly comfortable with. I think that, killing people is bad, but breeding people just to kill them is also bad. It's possible that Johannes is genuinely trying to protect his population, but I do think that his primary motivation is power, and I think that Johannes would not deny that his primary motivation is power. And Maggie, back in Arc 2, always insisted that the thing that she wanted is power. Nothing more. Not friends or anything. She wants power. Maggie, circa Arc 2, would have at least claimed to want Johannes' deal. But the Mags we see at the end of this, has grown beyond that lust for power. Mags wants to do good. And I am so grateful that she didn't take Johannes' deal, especially when I found out that other people had a different read than I did about Johannes' actions. Yeah. I approve. Speaking of which, yeah, Maggie goes and has one of the most badass fight scenes of all time. I feel like I'm skipping over a whole lot, but it's just awesome. She goes and blows up a bunch of goblins and then uses their blood to claim a new name. But I want to talk about Maggie's overall arc as we've gotten to this point. In 2.y, I gave her a lot of shit for acting childish, for being obsessed with being seen as older and seen as an adult. And at the beginning of this arc, she even talks to the other high schoolers using terms like real stuff to describe anything that happens outside or after high school. And not that I think this is unnatural, but I do think it is uncommon. Most high schoolers think that their concerns are valid, think that their concerns are real. And the point of this arc is that Maggie goes and talks to a bunch of different people and forges connections with everyone in town. But it's telling how she grows between conversations with certain people. For example, when she talks to Sandra, she's always interrupting her. She's always trying to say, oh, I know what you're about to say, and here's what it is. And Sandra's like, no, that's not what I was about to say. By the time she talks to Johannes, she is able to have like a normal conversation almost as equals. She is asking him for things, but she's not acting insecure. She talks to 2 sets of children during this arc. In the first one, she talks down to them. She calls them dorks. She tells them they need to tell their parents that they're not being raised correctly. She tries to act like the cool older teenager. And it's clear that the kids she's talking to are not like, oh man, cool older teenager. They're just like, lady, let us build our sandcastle. But then she talks to the kids in the middle school. And she treats them like people. She talks to them, she tells them exactly what's going on, she is honest with them, and she treats them with respect. So this arc largely has to do with Maggie maturing out of that exact insecurity that I was describing at several episodes ago from her interlude in 2.y. So at the end of 2.y, when she takes the name Mags, it's a less childish version of Maggie, right? It's the name that she had, but it isn't a child's nickname. And that brings me to a quote that I pulled from 2.y, where her dad says, but one of the first lessons that university hammers into you is that you have to let go of the past. Let go of who you were and let yourself be who you need to be. Let go of being miserable. Let go of hating people. That's this arc. She decides to stop being miserable about certain things, and she finds who she is. And she decides on a new name for herself. I really, really liked it. I also like the fact that she's become this ambassador. The beginning of this arc, she started out dealing with the Duham children. She already has a relationship with the people who will be leading the town 50 years from now. I think she's going to do a good job. And of course, her first job as ambassador appears to be dealing with the Thorburns. Again, speaking of which, so we see Rose come in with Ty, Tiff, and Alexis, and I'm just really glad that they came along. I'm glad that Rose didn't appear to be pressuring them, because again, I want Rose to be a good person. But I also really like Ty and Alexis, and Tiff is also there. Maybe Tiff will grow on me soon. I don't have anything against her. I just don't find her as interesting as the other two. So I'm pretty excited for what's coming next. So for my final point, I want to talk about representation in Wildbow's works and how it is completely different than it is in anything else I've ever seen. So I think that in the majority of media, the protagonist or narrator character is designed to be someone whom the audience can place their shoes in. Place their feet. Designed to be someone whose shoes the audience can place their feet in. They want you to be able to point at a character and say, that's me. Protagonists oftentimes are pretty milquetoast so that you can place yourself in their shoes. But Wildbow's characters are not like that. There's not a character that, first of all, there's no characters that I usually would ever describe as milquetoast. But there's also not a single character that I can truly say, that is the character that I relate to most. That is the character that most embodies my life. Because there are so many details that nothing can possibly match with basically anyone in the audience. And for that reason, I want to make a bold claim. And I don't know if Wildbow is doing this on purpose or not. He probably isn't. But the representation that we see in Wildbow's works is not for the benefit of the person being represented. It is for the benefit of the person who has never encountered that kind of representation. So for example, I've never met a person who had two fathers. And most people haven't, because most people don't have two dads. But having Mags as a narrator sort of allows us to learn what that's like. Mags isn't designed to be a character for the people with two fathers to be able to identify with. Mags is designed for us to be able to understand what that's like if we were to ever meet that person in real life. And that's kind of a weak example. The example I'm thinking more of is Blake. Meeting a rape victim in real life is something that you are much more likely to encounter. And a lot of people have really poor reactions to, interacting with people who have had that kind of trauma. Wildbow provides characters that we can empathize with, whose experiences we don't know, so that if we meet someone with those experiences in real life, we can already identify with them. And I have to say, I much prefer this setup. I have learned more about the world and the people in it from having to read about people I've never met anyone like than reading about people who I can see as being me. So yeah, that's this week's episode. Next week, starting with 9.1. See you at the next one.